Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RC 74. In today's episode I'm gonna talk about the first real builds on my carbon cup build. It's a 2.15 meter wingspan Horizon Hobby carbon cup, which I massively modify. The target is to build a similar plane to the full scale build made by Mike Patey. He took a carbon cup frame and built the Scrappy bush plane, which is an absolutely crazy bush plane. And finally, I started to go for the first custom parts, and then I'm gonna go through all the details I did so far. One of the most difficult parts to build were the knuckles for the double wishbone system to mount the wheels on the double wishbones, and this is the result how these double wishbone knuckles came out. They are completely made of brass tubes. The big tube is a 10mm outer diameter brass tube. Then you have a 5mm brass tube for the wheel axle and a 3mm brass tube for the rods which connect the knuckle to the wishbones. The inner diameters of the tubes is 8mm for the 10mm tube, then we have 4mm for the 5mm outer diameter tube and around 2.2mm on the 3mm tube. The most difficult part on the knuckles was to drill the holes, because they had to be exactly 90 degrees for the wheels and the wishbone mounts. So I had to outsource this job from a professional guy who has all the equipment which is needed. You can also see that the 3mm holes are not centered in the main tube, but they are offset. The top one is 1mm to the outside and the lower one is 1mm to the inside. This is just because of the original design of Scrappy, because you have the mount holes on the frame, on the fuselage, also a little narrower on the lower wishbone and a little wider on the top wishbone. So I did the same for my cup, for my build, and this is the result after the drilling, how the knuckles look. All the cutting and shaping and polishing of the 5 and 3mm tubes I did by myself. The 3mm tubes are 14mm in length, and the 5mm tube, to be honest, I don't know really exactly, but around 17mm. I'm not sure if I'm gonna use exactly this length, because as you can see, the knuckle is pretty close to the tire, and perhaps the wishbone, the double wishbone, the upper one, will touch the tire like this. So perhaps I will increase the length of the tube for the wheels, and that's also the reason why I didn't solder the brass parts together so far. I will first do the whole setup, so I have to finish all the double wishbones and put the whole double wishbone system together and look how it works, and then I will be ready to solder the knuckles together and also still be able to change the wheel tube to a longer size, just to make it the perfect fit for the wheel on the double wishbone suspension. To mount the wheel on the knuckle, there are two solutions. One could be a screw. This is just a sample, but it will be longer. The screw has to be around 8 centimeters. And the other solution is a simple rod. I'm not sure yet about the solution, what I will take to mount the wheel on the knuckles, but we will see later. I tend to go for the rod solution just because it's a little bit stronger than the screw, because the screw is a little thinner on the thread, and the tube has this full millimeter diameter the whole length through, so it will be a bit a stronger solution, and this I think will be the way I go. To make a perfect fit of the smaller tubes inside the 10mm tubes, I had to work on the holes in the 10mm tube, just because the smaller tubes, the 3 and 5mm tubes, are slightly bigger in diameter than these exactly 3 and 5mm. So I had to take a file, put it in the holes and spin the file in the holes. That makes sure that the hole stays exactly at the same position. You really widen the hole perfectly centered, and like this, as you can see, I have a perfect fit. The small tubes do not fall out of the thicker tube, so that's really a nice solution. It's just more or less copied the solution from Mike Patey. If I will increase the length of the wheel tube, I will perhaps also do the reinforcement, the 45-degree angle reinforcement, to make it possible to take more force on the wheel tube than if it's without the reinforcement, like you can see it now. Then it was time to shape and solder the skeleton for the double wishbone system. This is not a double wishbone like you will see it on the finished plane. This is just the inlay of the double wishbone. So what is missing now is that I will cover on top and bottom side, and also around the edges I will glue on carbon plates, 3mm carbon plates inlay, and top and bottom plate are 1.5mm carbon. So the reason for the skeleton parts is only that I have the perfect parallel line between the pivot point on the fuselage and the pivot point on the wheels. To reach this result, I've built a template on a steel plate and some aluminum profiles, and screwed the brass tubes onto the template, cut them exactly to the right length so they fit perfect. They cannot move anymore in the template, and like this I was really able to build 4 exactly identical skeleton parts. I'm really happy with the result. Everything is perfect in shape, and I'm really excited to go on and wrap the whole skeleton parts in carbon plates to see the final shape of the double wishbones. To solder the double wishbone tubes together, I used my heat gun. I had to heat it up to around 600 degrees. Like this, the solder was super easy. I used also some flux on each solder point, then put around some solder and heated up each spot, and like this the result looks pretty perfect. The skeletons are absolutely flat. I think the wishbones will come out pretty nice. The missing openings on the double wishbones will be cut later after all the wrapping with carbon, because I have to open the center part of the wheel side, and I also have to cut off some area of the tube on the fuselage side. As you can see, the mounts are narrower than the brass tubes, but I will cut the final shape of the double wishbones after wrapping of the whole skeleton with the carbon plates. Because of the extreme heat of the heat gun on my template, the template tends to bend a little bit, so I had to use some tools to push down the end part of the tubes to make sure that both ends of the solder spot of the tube stay on the same level, so I don't have any bent or strange shape on the solder spots. Next step was to build the first carbon parts. These are the mounts of the double wishbone system to mount it on the fuselage. As you can see, there are different layers of carbon. So I took an inner layer, which is a 3mm plate, and outer layer, which is 1mm. The front and the rear part are not exactly same layers. The reason for this is just because I used laying around carbon plates, didn't buy anything new, so I just took what I have laying around. So the result is that front part is 3mm plate inlays, and outer side each is 1mm plate, and on the rear one I have a 1.5mm on the front, a 1mm on the rear, and between are two plates, one is 1mm and one is also 1.5, and always the whole width together is around 5mm. So first I had to design the whole parts. I did this with some carbon templates I designed, and after the carbon templates I drawed the whole template onto the carbon plates. To prepare the carbon plates I used frog tape, which works perfect to cover carbon plates or any other material, to work on it, to drill on it, to draw a whole design for any parts. Then I cut out all the parts. I did this just roughly. The first layer I also already drilled the exact holes for the screws I can put in the mount, and the holes I will use to mount the double wishbones. Then I had to sand all the areas of each plate where I glue the different plates together, the different layers together. And then I used CA glue from Uhu, which is a really quick glue. So I was a little surprised how quick I had to work. So it wasn't a nice and slow work, but it was really quick to put the whole layers together. But luckily everything went out good. After the glue was cured, I was able to sand down the perfect shape. And as you can see on the shape of the carbon parts, there are also two parts like teeth looking. They go into the fuselage and they help to carry any twist force on the double wishbone suspension mount. This really helps to carry the whole forces, to avoid to go with the whole forces only on the screws. And like this, I think it sits really strong in the fuselage. I think the landing gear, or at least the landing gear mount, will be definitely strong enough to carry the whole weight in any kind of landing on every terrain. The screws I use for screwing on the mounts on the fuselage are 2.5mm and 12mm in length. They really fit so perfect in these holes that don't even need any nuts on the other side of the mount. So I simply can screw in the 2.5mm screws. I will perhaps use some Loctite to secure them perfectly, and both double wishbone mounts will stay perfectly in place. The reason why I built these mounts in different layers is that I can save some weight. So I have this whole hollow area on both mounts, so this really saves some weight. There is no need to have this inner part with full 5mm carbon. This is strong enough with only 1mm on each layer on the outside. After all the layers were glued together, I was able to drill the holes through all the layers. I firstly drilled the holes only on the top layer, just because I wanted to be sure that the holes are perfect, same spot on all layers. So only drilled one layer, glued all the parts together, all the layers together, and then took the already existing holes, drilled through these holes through all the other layers, and like this I have perfect same positions of the holes through all the layers. To make the double wishbone mounts fit perfect in the fuselage, I also had to reduce the width of the mounts in the area where they go deep into the part of the fuselage where the stock suspension is mounted. So these 5mm were slightly too wide, so I had to sand down a few tenths of a millimeter to make the two parts really fit perfectly in the stock mount. The last step I did so far is on the rims of these custom wheels. These custom wheels are a bit bigger than the stock wheels. They are also wider than the stock wheels. And the most important difference is that they are much lighter. So they are, after my modification, they are around 15 grams each lighter than the stock wheels. And the modification I did on the rims is that with the stock width of the rims, they sit very deep in the tire. I decided to install some 10mm aluminum spacers between the two parts of the rims, and this helped for two things. First was to, in my opinion, get a great shape, a great look of the rims, how deep they sit in the tire, not too deep, not too far out of the tire. I think that looks really good. And the other thing I really like on this solution is that I don't need any nuts. So on both sides I only use hex screws, and like this the rims look really clean. You don't have a nasty end of the screws with the nuts, but just screw heads on both sides, and in my opinion that looks a little better, looks cleaner, and the rims are around 4 grams heavier each than without the spacers. But these 4 grams won't matter for the whole build, because the whole modifications I do on the plane will make the plane definitely heavier than the stock build of this carbon cup. So this is it about the steps I did so far, all the custom parts I've built so far. Next steps will be to build up the whole double wishbones with all the carbon plates, install the double wishbones on the fuselage, install the knuckles on the double wishbones, and then my RC Scrappy build will sit the first time on its own custom-made suspension. So I'm really excited for these steps, because I have to see how this looks like. I think this will look awesome, and yeah, looking forward for the next build steps. Videos will follow about all the steps, all the details will come up. So thanks for watching so far. I hope you liked the video. Thanks for watching. Have a good time. Happy flying. Bye bye.